Now, just ask some questions and go to the Bible and see what answers you have. I have a booklet here which I authored a couple of years ago entitled 101 Contradictions in the Bible. I'd like to offer a copy to Mr. Smith so that you don't have to turn around and strain your neck looking at these. He can be able to formulate a reply for me. Because I'm very interested in knowing, is there really a reply for this? Because nobody has been able to give me that reply. Who incited David to count the fighting men of Israel? According to 2 Samuel, God did. According to 1 Chronicles, Satan did. You can't have it both ways, folks. Now let's go to the next contradiction, number 2. Is that count, or in that count, how many fighting men were found in Israel? According to 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 9, 800,000. According to 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 5, 1,100,000. That's a difference of 300,000 men, and you don't just round off 300,000 men. Now let's go to the next contradiction, number 3. How many fighting men were found in Judah? According to one report, 2 Samuel, 500,000. According to 1 Chronicles, 470,000. Mind you, these numbers were all written out in words. It's not just that you dropped a zero or something like this. But, the words were written out in full in Hebrew characters, and this is the problem you have. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the Bible says that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And then you must decide now, if this Bible is divided against itself, can we say that all of it is from God? And this is what we have to be honest with, folks. Now, how many years of famine was David threatened with? According to 2 Samuel 7, according to 1 Chronicles 3. I'm using things for which there's no need for any interpretation. So you can't quarrel with me over the interpretation. The numbers are there, they're clear. Now, what you should ask yourself is this. If you find a book that has this kind of things in it, would you be happy to turn that in and say, this is my book, I wrote this? Would you turn a paper to one of your professors if it has mistakes in it and you'd be proud to say, that one with the mistakes, that's mine? See, you have to be clear and know what you're saying about God. Now, I'm not here to criticize the Bible. I'm not here to upset any Christians. I agree the Bible is a very good book. And I know that many Christians are sincere, devout worshippers of God, and they're trying to do the right thing. And the Bible has helped them to change their lives around, to give up drinking, adultery, gambling, and all kinds of things which Muslims also find to be wrong. As I've said before, God does speak through the Bible. But to what extent does He speak? And to what extent do others, apart from God, also speak? You can see this kind of thing here is the result of other people speaking in the Bible. Now let's go to the next one. Number 5. How old was Ahaziah when he began to rule over Jerusalem? Was he 22 or was he 42? Well, actually, I share this one with you. I'll let the cat out of the bag. He couldn't have been 42. You know why? Because if he was 42 at the time, his dad was 40 years old. So he would have been 2 years older than his dad. Unless, of course, the Bible has got the dad's age wrong. That could also be possible. Let's go to the next one. Contradiction number 6. How old was Jehoiakim when he became king of Jerusalem? According to one report, 18. According to another one, 8. Both are in the Bible. Which one will you believe? Let's go to number 7. How long did this lad rule over Jerusalem? According to one report, 3 months. According to another one, 3 months and 10 days. Now you might excuse this one and say that perhaps he rounded it off. It was 3 months and 10 days, but the other writer may have rounded it off. We don't know for sure. Let's go to number 8. The chief of the mighty men of David lifted up his spear and killed how many men at one time? Either 800 or 300. God is not the author of confusion, says the Bible in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. Who authored these? Not God. Let's go to the next contradiction. Contradiction number 9. When did David bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem? Before defeating the Philistines or after? According to one book, before. According to another one, after. And both are in the Bible. Next contradiction. Number 10. How many pairs of clean animals did God tell Noah to take into the Ark? Either 2 or 7. But despite this last instruction, only 2 pairs actually went into the Ark when they were taken in. So, does that sound confusing? Well, if it does, then know that God did not author this part in the Bible. Now, I notice that some of you are taking hurried notes, and that's important because you need to check these out. I also have copies of this booklet available outside for a small paltry sum of £1. So you may be able to get a copy on your way out. I don't have a copyright restriction, so you're free to copy it, circulate it, study it, and formulate a reply. Send me that. I'll really be happy to see where I'm wrong on that. Now, number 11. Let's go to number 11. When David defeated the king of Zobah, how many horsemen did he capture? According to one book, 1,700. According to another book, 7,000. Can you just skip a few pages so we get a different flavor? All right, because we're dealing with a lot of numbers here, and it gets boring after a while. You know, there's only so much numbers you can take. One place in the Bible it says that Solomon built a pool 10 cubits in diameter and 30 cubits in circumference. And folks, you know that's impossible, because every high school math student knows that. I just asked my kids who started high school, and they said, no, Dad, pi is 3.1416 times 10. That will give us the circumference of the pool at 31.4 cubits. Could be 30. And if you're rounding off, you might go 31.5, but you wouldn't go 30. So something is not entirely right there. You cannot find a pool that's 10 cubits in diameter and 30 cubits in circumference. Well, Smith, if you can find me one like that, I'll be ready to baptize myself. Okay. And if you cannot, then perhaps you should consider the Quran with care. Because that's what the Quran invites us to do. أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ. Have they not considered the Quran with care? وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. If it had been from any other than God, you would have found in it much discrepancy. The kind of things which we're noticing here. So contradiction, we're still dealing with numbers. Even if I've asked the gentleman to skip pages, but there's so many numerical contradictions here. Okay, now both Ezra and Nehemiah, they say that they had this assembly and they counted all the people. The total was 42,360. Yet when you go to the inventory list, you see how many of these people and how many of the others and so on. You find that the numbers do not add up. In one book, it's 29,000. It took me a long time to add these numbers, but that's what it comes up to. The two do not add up together. Well, you don't need to take a long time to add these numbers. I mean, there's a passage in the Bible which says, the sons of this man were 6, and it gives you the list of the 6 names, and you see that there are only 5. So you know that there's something wrong somewhere. Now, I have 101 of these to show you, but that will take too long, and it gets boring and pointless.
In 630s and 640s. Now, there are quite a few questions here. There's a number of them on contradictions, and people are asking me, are there not contradictions also in the Quran? And I meant, Shabir, I was going to deal with the questions on contradictions, but we just didn't have time. Let me just refer to that. In the same paper on the Quran that you can get on the website, I've got 38 contradictions which we find in the Quran itself. Shabir says that if it is the Word of God, there should not be any contradictions. The problem is that there's lots of contradictions. In fact, there's a law of abrogation or contradiction is taught in the Quran in Surah 2, 106, to 108, which states, we substitute one revelation for another. This is echoed in Surah 1786, which it reads, if it were our will, we could take away that which we have sent thee by inspiration. In Surah 16, 101. We read, none of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, but we substitute something better or similar. Knowest thou not that Allah hath power over all things? These are taken from Yusuf Ali's translation. So there's a law of contradiction built into the Quran. Why does he have a problem with these contradictions in the Bible? It's interesting, and you probably all noticed that almost all the contradictions were numerical contradictions. Did you not notice that? We're well aware of this. What is going on here? What is happening? When you look, and if you've found anybody that has studied manuscript evidence, anybody that's gone back to ancient manuscripts, one of the things that you will find, rule of thumb, that anybody that's studied ancient manuscripts, is that numbers are always copied wrong when copies are made of copies of copies of copies. We don't have the originals of these manuscripts. We know that. When copies are made, what happens? In the earliest days, they were written on scrolls. They were not written in books as we have today. Books were not really brought into existence until the 4th century. When you have scrolls, they wear out. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, Shabir Ali says that these were written out in words. They were actually written out in numbers, numerical numbers. You had the radical numbers at the top, and you had the uncial numbers at the bottom. Whenever you have the radical numbers at the top, that means on the side of the scrolls, if there's going to be any wearing out, it'd be those radical numbers that are worn out. Note and look through Shabir Ali's book. I challenge you to do so, and look at the numbers that are rubbed out. It's almost always the decadal numbers that are rubbed out. Now, if there is a scribe that's going to then copy that over, that would be the number that he would not copy over. So what do we have here? Basically, these are copyist errors. Now, it's interesting that if you do a comparison between the Masoretic text, which is the text 1 minute, thanks. The text which was that we use today that was compiled by the Masoretes in 918. Compare it with the Septuagint that was compiled in 125 BC. You will find that many of these problems do not exist in the Septuagint. That many of these numbers are adequate. I'm sorry, that's not the right word. Are plausible. In fact, make a lot of sense. So you can see that between 125 AD, BC, and 918 AD, there has been copyist errors. We're aware of that. We're quite aware of that. That's not a problem. We would expect that. You would not expect that in a revelation that came within a 23-year period, though. Why is it all? And I've got 38. They're listed here. We have another paper that's on the Johann Katz's site that has many more contradictions. Radical contradictions, numerical contradictions, contradictions with the complete theologies there. Read our papers, and I can just name some off. Maybe when we have more time, I'll go through some of these contradictions that we find in the Quran. That's a real problem. Okay? Or do I have more time?
Time.
Now, contradictions in the Quran. You know, something missed me. It must be that I'm very deaf, but I heard Mr. Smith read out 4 passages from the Quran, or mention 4 passages and what they say, but I couldn't for the life of me sense what is the contradiction there. Perhaps he can tell us again, and then I will reply to them. So this is what amazes me. The best people can come up with as contradictions are just little quibbles over words here and meanings here. But we're showing actual proof, and that brings me to the third point. Now, Smith admits that there are numerical errors in the Bible. Well, great. And this is what we've been saying. And remember what I said before. The people who come to argue with us are not believers in the Bible. They know that the Bible has errors. So they're not so interested in defending that. They're interested in attacking something else. They're interested in causing doubt so that, they have lost faith. And they're interested in causing doubt in other people too, so that they should also lose faith. Somehow it is like this. I mean, if you admit you have a book and it makes mathematical errors, it tells you there are 6 people and you can count them, there are only 5. It tells you 15 cities and you can count them, there are 16. Matthew tells you there are 13 generations from the Babylonian exile to Jesus. You can count them. He tells you there are 14, there are only 13. So if you say a name has dropped out there, a 0 has fallen out there, what are you saying? You're saying your book is full of holes. Do I have 1 minute more? So if that is what it is, then please admit that and let's go forward. We discuss more from there. We recognize who we're dealing with. If you're dealing as a believer or half a believer, we have to know that. But folks, it's not just numerical contradictions. I know that the numbers were not written as numbers, they were spelled out as words. And we don't just lose a 0. I mean, how do you go from 800 to 1100, round off 300 men? How do you go from that? You don't just lose a 0 and 8 has to be changed to an 11. Alright? Now, but there are others. When you come to the life of Jesus, where he was at a particular time, which day he was, which place, all of that is very contradictory. What he said on a certain occasion has been changed by certain gospel writers to give a new impression of what Jesus should mean for us. It's not just contradiction in numbers. I've given you those so we don't argue over interpretation. I've given you clear contradictions, and there are many more as well. Thank you very much.
All right, let's do, since we're talking about contradictions, let's stick with contradictions. I think you misunderstood what I was saying, Shabir. I wouldn't say that those were contradictions. That's the law of contradiction, of abrogation that is in the Quran. Let me give you some contradictions now since you've asked for that. Let's go through some of the contradictions. You talk about numerical contradictions. What are you going to do with the Surah 7, 54, Surah 25, 59, which speaks that there are 6 days in creation. Then Surah 41, Ayah 9 through 12, talks that there are 8 days in creation. Numerical errors, 2 different numbers for the same amount of the same creation. There's a numerical error. Now, you cannot blame this on copyist error. You cannot blame this on scribal error, because this is, we're talking about only 1,200 years ago, not 1,400 years ago. What about the plagues? Let me give you these contradictions. Numerical errors again. In Surah 17, Ayah 101, we have 9 plagues listed, or signs. Whereas in Surah 7, 133, only 5 were listed. Again, a contradiction in numbers. And I could go on. There are others. Let me just give you some others as examples, just so you know what I'm talking about. In Surah 3, Ayah 84, also Surah 2, Ayah 285, Surah 2, Ayah 136, it talks that that all prophets are initially equal, that they are equal in status. Then in Surah 2, 253, suddenly it says that some are elevated above others. Let's continue on down. Let's go through some. I'm going flipping through because there's a whole pile here I could go to. I don't want to waste too much time. In Surah Careful. In Surah 17:103, we are told that Pharaoh was drowned with his army. Yet in Surah 10, 90 to 92, we are, upon admitting of the power of God, he is rescued as a sign to others. Angels are commanded to bow down to Allah. Bow down to Adam in Surah 15, ayah 29 to 30. And also in Surah 20, 116, which they do. Yet Allah prohibits anyone worshipping anyone but Him in Surah 4, 116. And also Surah 18, 110. In Surah 4, 157, we read that Jesus did not die. Yet in Surah 19:33, we read that not only did He die, but He rose again. And this, there you get. You have a problem with abrogation. The words of the Lord are perfect and true in justice. There's none who can change His word. It says in Surah 6, 115. Now talk about abrogation. What does it say here? Nobody can change the word of Allah. Also, as you see this in 6:34 and also 10:65. But then Allah sees the need to change some of them for better ones. Surah 2, 106, 16:1. The whole law of abrogation goes against what He just said earlier. There's an abrogation right there. Now what are you going to do with that? Guiding to the truth. Let me just continue on with this. Guiding to the truth, say God, He guides the truth and which is worthier to be followed in Surah 10:35. But how much is left over from this worthiness when we also read, Allah leads astray whom He pleases, and He guides whom He pleases, Surah 14:4. And how do we know in which of Allah's categories of pleasures we fall? What about the punishment of adultery? Flogging with 100 stripes, according to for men and women, in Surah 24, ayah 2. Confine them to houses until death do they claim them. Lifelong house arrest for the women in Surah 4:15. Seems to abrogate exactly what we've seen about the flogging. What are you going to do with that? So you do see that there's a lot of problems with contradictions. Now I've heard Muslims who have tried to answer this say, well, this has to do with progressive revelation. That things change in Muhammad's life, so therefore it followed his life issue. Now we have the same categories within Christendom, and we talk about this in theology, that there's a progressive revelation. Progressive revelation makes sense when you're dealing with different cultures, when you're dealing with different eras, when you're dealing with different people. What God said to Abraham, what God said to Moses back in 1400 BC and 2300 and 1900 BC would not apply to people that come 100 to 1,000 to 2,000 years later. So therefore there would be a need for a different revelation. Just as cultures changes, so does the revelation that changes for them. I find this with my own sons. I have laws and regulations for my younger son, which I don't have for my older son as he grows up. Then more is expected of them. But we would not expect this in a time period of just 23 years. And this is what we find in the Quran. Why are these abrogations there? Some people have counted 222 abrogations or contradictions in the Quran. Why are they there? It does not make sense. Now let's go on to another area. I don't know if can we get onto this or how are we doing on it? 45 seconds. The Gospel of Barnabas. What are we going to do with the Gospel of Barnabas? Somebody asks. Is it not also a book that we should adhere to because it speaks about Muhammad? The Gospel of Barnabas, I think you just need to read. Anybody who has a copy, read and look at it. You will find that there's an awful lot in the Gospel of Barnabas that also contradicts the Quran. All right. What we do find, if you look at the Gospel of Barnabas, you can find that whoever wrote the Gospel of Barnabas never lived in Palestine. It talks, what does it say? It says that Capernaum is up in the mountains. It says that Galilee is down on the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth on the Sea of Galilee, and Capernaum is up the mountains. Obviously, anybody who's been to Canaan will know that that's completely impossible.
I'll have to be quick so that I can get on with some of your questions too, to be fair to you. But very quickly, contradictions. Does the Quran contradict itself saying 6 days and 8 days? No, because the verse which is commonly quoted to say that means 8 days doesn't mean that. Does the Quran say God created the heavens and the earth in 8 days? No. It says that God created the earth in 2 days. They measured out the sustenance in 4 days. So you make that 6. God also says that He turned to the heavens when it was smoke and called it, and the earth powered in 2 days. So you see, God created the heavens and the earth in the same first 2 days. But it just so happens the way it's mentioned in the Quran, 2 days for the earth, 4 days for the sustenance, making 6. Then when God mentions again that He created the heavens and the earth in 2 days, they're adding it up to make it 8. But how can you add what you've already counted? You counted the first 2 days, then you counted 4 more. Now you're mentioning the first 2 days again, and you're counting that to make it 8. You know, it doesn't make any sense. So that's not a contradiction. And that shows us, that, the people who have wasted their lives to find contradictions in the Quran, this is the kind of nonsense that they come up with. Number 2, he said, this surah mentions 9 plagues, that surah mentions 5 plagues. Did any surah of the Quran say, the maximum number God mentioned is 5, because if it did, then the next one that says 9 would contradict. But if one surah says, these are the things which God did to Pharaoh, and list them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another surah says, these are what God did to Pharaoh, list them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. They're not contradictory. It's just that one has given you more details which are not found in the other one. That's not a contradiction. It's a contradiction if one says no more than 5 and the other one says 9. Then you know you didn't make a contradiction. That's the kind of thing that I've been pointing out in the Bible. Give me something similar in the Quran. If you cannot, then at least accept tonight, look, the Quran has a better claim to be the Word of God than the Bible does. Third contradiction. In one surah it says all prophets are equal. In another surah it says that some prophets are elevated above others. Well, that's not a contradiction. Because the place where it says, we believe in all of the prophets. لَا نُفَرِّقُ بَيْنَ أَحَدٍ مِّنْهُمْ. We do not differentiate between any of them. That says that we as believers will not say we accept one prophet and reject the other. Because as prophets of God, they're all on an equal plane. But among prophets, there are some who God preferred above others. There are many stones in the world, but some are precious stones. They're still called stones, but they're all stones. Some are better stones than others. So they're all prophets. We don't reject one and accept another one, but some of these prophets God has preferred above others. Just like you wear certain stones on your finger, but not some others. Now, Pharaoh was drowned according to the Quran. Does that contradict with the Quran which says that God rescued him? No, because if you quote the verse, if you go rapid fire, surah this, ayah number that, surah 3, ayah number that, then we don't know what you're saying. But if you stop and you quote the verses and show why it is contradictory, you see it is not. The verse which says that God saved him says, فَالْيَوْمَ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً. Today we save you in your body that you may be a sign for those who will come later. Pharaoh was drowned, the Quran was right. And Pharaoh's body was saved, the Quran was right. And the Quran was right long before this information could be discovered. Hundreds of years later on, in 1898, the body of the Pharaoh was discovered. Yes, God had saved that body as a sign for people who will come later. The Quran mentions something about the Pharaoh which could not have been known to the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, that his body was saved. The Bible does not give that impression. It just gives you the impression that Pharaoh was drowned. He was left there to perish in the ocean. Whereas in fact his body was saved. The Quran didn't contradict itself, but gave us information for which we can respect it. Angels bow down to Adam. Does the Quran say that the angels worship Adam? No. So if you find another verse which says worship only God, that doesn't contradict. In ancient times, people used to bow down to their kings. We find that in the story of Yusuf, that people were bowing down to their kings. It was acceptable, but in the Sharia of Muhammad, God abrogated that law. Is there anything wrong with abrogation? No, Christians accept abrogation. Mr. Smith himself said he accepts abrogation. He said it shouldn't be in 23 years. Well, if you have a growing community, just like you have your growing kids, what you say to your 23-year-old is not the same thing that you say to your 3-year-old. And you can't even speak to your 15-year-old. Did the Quran say that Jesus died and rose again? No. The Quran said that God lifted him up and they killed him, not crucified him. So God raised him, but not after death. The Quran doesn't contradict itself.